this list has grown like crazy, and it's so exciting to see individuals not only join the network, but also to participate in a lot of the things that we have going on. Our mission, again, is to make Cincinnati just a more positive space and to make workplaces a more positive place to work. And so I'm really excited to have all of these organizations join us today. Kyla, I saw you raise your hand. Did you want to ask something? Okay.
Kyla and I are waving. We're waving back. Yes.
Got it. Okay. So before we get started, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. And so I know that everybody has read the emails and people are joining into the session, but here's what I want you to do. And I'm gonna actually open up the chat. I really want people to type in what they think this session, what they hope to gain from a session as we talk about having a coaching conversation in a very complex time, or having coaching conversations just as a rule. What is a coaching conversation to you? You can just type that into the chat.
A chance to provide support for another teammate and hear their needs, concerns.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. And it's interesting that you say a chance to provide support for another teammate. Lots of times people think about coaching as more of a manager or mentor to potentially someone less senior. Anybody else? No, this is the tough one. Helping a team member become more aware. Yeah, positive support and guidance to work towards goals, helping to navigate through challenges and highlight successes. Absolutely. An opportunity to walk towards shared goals and feedback on the process. Libby says this is about being growth oriented, and then also address concerns with staff. Anybody else want to jump in? Because all of these are true and all of these are right. Today, we're going to talk through a strengths-based coaching, and we know that once you know about your strengths, it's important to calibrate them just right so that we neither are underusing or overusing them in any given situation. And in a strength-based organization, it's important to be able to navigate strengths during complex times. And so one of the things that we always talk about in the Institute is that strengths don't exist in a vacuum, and bringing out the best of in each other is really, really, really important. But we know in order to do that, we need to have three things, and that we want to be able to introduce those things today as we talk about having coaching conversations. The first thing is having psychological safety. We need to have that as the foundation of everything that you do inside of this work, whether you're talking to a teammate, whether you're a manager talking to your team, whether you are being managed and want to provide some feedback to your manager. You need to have a space that is psychologically safe. And so we're going to talk a lot about psychological safety today. And then we're going to go into the next part as we talk about radical candor. As you remember from the Institute, radical candor is built on the idea, on the principles of being able to challenge directly, but also care personally. What we want to do is we're going to start to talk about using radical candor while also leaning into our strengths and combating our own personal biases. And then finally, we're going to give you a chance to try it out on your own, right? You're going to learn about psychological safety. You're going to learn about radical candor. And then we're going to give you some coaching hypotheticals. And these are just going to be tips for building your feedback skills. So let's be honest. Most of the time when we think about coaching others, we think about this top-down mentoring relationship, right? But the reality is that coaching can happen in a million different ways, and it doesn't always happen in this top-down or ongoing relationship situation. There's always a traditional coaching as a manager. You're providing feedback to a team member, but there's also an opportunity for employees to offer feedback up to a manager or potentially even a senior leader. And then there's the opportunity to provide coaching as a peer. So maybe you work on a team and there's somebody who either may be new to the team or somebody who's been working on a team for a long time, and you want to provide them just some positive and or critical feedback. And then finally, there's also as a mentor. This is those opportunities where you have somebody who has done the thing that it is that you're looking to do, and they provide you feedback to help you get to that space faster. And then there's also, as a senior leader, there's those opportunities for senior leaders to sometimes talk to different people inside of their organization, to be able to not only set an example, but to provide proactive coaching in different situations based on their perspective and where they are. And again, as a friend, that's a little bit like peer-to-peer, but the benefit of the friendship is that sometimes you can have much more critical conversations with potentially not, while not being able to put that relationship at stake. And then finally, as an upstander, and those are the people who stand up against systems or instances of bullying, misconduct, or systems of oppression. So I want to jump in and get to the actual work and the fun part of all of this. And I want you to describe a great coaching conversation that you had with someone or someone had with you. And the question becomes, what made it effective and what were the outcomes? I'm going to give you guys about 6 minutes to go into rooms. We're going to break into groups of 3. And I always remember the best coaching conversation that I ever had in my life was done with my boss at one of my very first professional jobs. I was working at the Toledo Urban League. And at the time, I thought I was a hot shot. And my manager was actually younger than me. And one day he had to pull me to the side and he said, Phil, you know, sometimes you're in these meetings and every single pushback that you get, all you do is just like push back with so much force and you're creating more enemies than you are allies. And so it's going to be important for you to be able to figure out not only how to use a hammer, because right now all you have is a hammer and everything looks like a nail. And so you have to figure out, one, how to turn people that may feel like enemies or feel like they're pushing back on you into allies. And you have to open your ears enough to hear exactly what it is that they're saying instead of thinking that they're attacking you personally. So, I mean, that really just changed my perspective on the way that I approached all of my work. So it's an exciting time. Maya is going to take us into breakout rooms and have some conversations about, you know, what is a great conversation, a great coaching conversation look like for you and what made it effective? And then what were the outcomes from that conversation? So welcome back, everyone. I would love to spend some time kind of walking through each of these great conversations, but we have so many exercises that we have to do that I'm going to pass it over to Janice so she can get us to the exercises, get us to the actual fun stuff.
Yeah, and thank you, Phil. But actually, keep that in mind, that great coaching conversation. And as you go through and listen to everything that's going to be said, like what parts of that showed up? Why it'll probably reinforce why it was effective, what the outcomes were. And as we talked about, the biggest foundation, and this was so interesting as we, really dive into our research and understand what's out there and what makes sense is this term psychological safety. You've certainly heard it. It's become very popular over the last 5 years or so. But it was founded by a researcher, really. The beginning of it was mostly in 1999. Amy Edmondson, Harvard professor, started looking into it and understanding it and really identifying what it meant. And has recently written a book about it, The Fearless Organization, which I recommend to anyone. It's really a good fast read, but it's very interesting because it's all about creating this space that we all want, where people can speak up honestly. There is no fear of interpersonal retribution in any way. It's safe because you can take risks. So that means you can be creative, which is wonderful, but also you can speak up when something goes wrong. And I think that is almost, we forget about that. Like sometimes we don't speak up when we see something happening that, that our bosses really need to hear. And we don't speak up because we think, well, somebody else will say it, or I don't want to risk my hide, or somebody, and this is even goes back to radical candor. I want to protect myself, or I want to protect someone else. But if we don't speak up, then it manifests and it multiplies in its impact. So if, an example she talks about, for instance, is what happened at Volkswagen. When their senior leadership, they were functioning from an old-fashioned strategy of fear-based leadership. So senior leader, the CEO said, I need you to figure this out in 6 weeks, come up with a solution for low emissions diesel fuel cars. And it was really an impractical and impossible goal, but people felt like their hides were at stake, everything. So they did it. They did what they could, and everybody kept quiet and didn't push back and say, can't do this, won't do this, these are the risks, this is what's going to happen. And while they met their short-term goals, if anybody remembers a few years ago, the whole company almost blew up and lost its whole everything financially, because they ended up it was a big lie that they hadn't achieved it, and they had a recall on their people. Actually, you could, claim that lives were lost because of it. It was a really catastrophic fail, and it was all based on not having a strategy or a foundation of psychological safety. So we really want to keep thinking about that, and it's an easy thing to talk about and say, but in real life, for it to happen, like, you have to ask yourself, would I be willing, whenever you have that feeling inside of you, like, oh, should I speak or not? Or I'm scared I might sound dumb, or then you don't have it and you need to work at getting it more. So what we're going to do, what she developed, what Amy came up with a lot, which a lot of organizations use, is a survey, 7 questions. And we're going to actually go through this now a little bit. We're going to ask you to take out your phone and go to menti.com. Okay. And I'm going to go there too. And we're going to take a little survey that you can answer individually, just on, your own personal experience, to try to identify what level of psychological safety do we all feel. And it'll be interesting. We've never done this before. So these are 7 questions. Let me see if I can I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to get off of this. And now, you see my Menti, do you? Yes. And so what I want you to do, go to menti.com and then enter the code. You can all see the code there, 93493575. Right? 93493575. And if you get on, then start answering the questions, and I'll read them out loud. But you can answer them just as you do them. And so how would you rank it from strongly agree, or you can move it up to strongly disagree is on the left, strongly agree is on the right. Disagree on the left, agree on the right. If you make a mistake at your job, it is never held against you. Do you agree with that? Strongly agree or strongly disagree? You can start voting. Are folks on? Thumbs up if you're on? Mm-hmm. Members of your organization are able to bring up problems and tough issues. For you personally, is that true? Strongly disagree or strongly agree? And we should be able to start seeing it load live. Yes, there you go. People in your organization never reject others for being different. It is easy to ask other members of your organization for help. No one in your organization would deliberately act in a way that undermines your efforts. And then working with members of your organization, your unique skills and talents are valued and utilized. So we'll wait another couple of seconds to see if anybody else is going to get on. We have a total of, there should be a few more people. If you can do it, it's great. We have a total of 20 people with us today. You can see how it moves when 1 or 2 people answer and change. So I'll give it one more countdown. Okay, so it's an interesting, these survey questions you can use yourself in your own organization internally. I phrase it slightly differently than she traditionally has people do it, but a lot of people, you can adapt it to meet your environment. And I'm not surprised to see that we have a lot of strong psychological safety among us, but you can see that I think it's interesting to see if you make a mistake at your job, it's never held against you. That's the one where there's a little bit of weakness there, or just questions because, she talks about this, that she's not trying to create this world where there aren't consequences, right? So maybe that language, you do have to be responsible for stuff, but it shouldn't be held against you. Like a mistake, it tars you forever, and that doesn't allow you to succeed. Because what she talks about, so this is just a good survey, and I can share this with anyone if you want to use this kind of a Menti thing with your team. But what she talks about in order to create that space of psychological safety are really, I'm going to go back now, I'm going to go off of this and go back to sharing my PowerPoint, if I can find it.
Hey, Janice, while you're transitioning back, just an example that someone shared with me one time about that kind of relates to psychological safety that I thought was really illustrates it in a concrete way. Think about how many times you sat down to write an email. Maybe it's to a peer or to a supervisor, to share some updates or some information, and it takes you a really, really long time because you're not quite sure how to phrase it, and you're deleting things and going back, and it takes you forever. That oftentimes can be an indicator that maybe there's not that level of trust or psychological safety, as opposed to being able to communicate kind of openly and freely without worrying about how things are perfectly communicated. It's just I've found myself realizing that at times in writing emails. So just something that might help you relate to the concept a little bit.
Yeah. I think it's a muscle that you build over time as you are in a new organization, no matter what they tell you about a safe and open space, until you practice that a little bit and have an opportunity of being vulnerable and watch other people be vulnerable, which really is part of the 3 steps that she talks about. So first thing she recommends is to frame the whole work, everything we do, as a learning opportunity rather than an execution problem. And what that means is, like, you're not being graded pass fail on something. It's sort of the idea, well, it is a lot about growth mindset. It's all that work about being that Carol Dweck, you've probably heard that all talked about. And in fact, she has a great TED talk. If anybody wants to search on that, I can send you that as well. But it's about being able to know that you are have the opportunity to continue to learn and to continue to grow, and that a mistake is just on your road to success. What you're going to do, you're going to stumble fast, you're going to fail fast, and that's all accepted in the culture. For us, when we talk about coaching, it really is then the opportunity when you're giving feedback to focus on strengths. So when you can get into a coaching conversation where you can talk about, well, I think really, it didn't work, and that's maybe because you were overusing your judgment, and you weren't just letting yourself be inspired by your creativity. So maybe, cut back on that. So that kind of thing, that kind of counsel where you can focus on somebody's top strengths and overusing a strength or underusing a strength, and really give them some sense of the ability to keep leaning in or to keep evolving in a way, it's going to make it a safe place to work. Second thing that she focuses on is this acknowledgement of one's own fallibility. And this really is especially, from the leadership on down, being vulnerable and admitting that we all make mistakes, that failure is part of everyone's history, no matter, everybody who's successful has probably a legion of years where they really struggled. And it's good to share that. And I always, it's really talking about leaning into your combination of honesty and humility from a strengths perspective, tugging on both of those. And hopefully, it has to come from leadership. But in any leadership position you're in, or any coaching position you're in, even when you start a coaching conversation with, let's say, a peer, the first thing to be able to say is, I understand this is hard. I've been there too, to share some of your own personal experiences and show that, that we're all fallible. And the last thing she talks about, which I love, is, of course, model curiosity. Always ask questions. And so depending on where curiosity falls in terms of your strengths, if it's a top one, then just lean right in and always, just create a sense of being inquisitive. And so then that's not judging and that's not attacking, it's asking questions. If it's not one of your top strengths, then we toe it up. We find a way to consciously, intentionally look to toe it up by maybe blending it with one of our top strengths. So we think about if humor is really a top strength, maybe there's a funny way to ask questions and put somebody at ease, but be able to have that conversation, which is not accusatory, but in fact inspiring. So that's the psychological safety that's needed in order to have healthy, rich coaching conversations that will be actively heard and helpful. So I'm now going to hand it over to Maya, who's going to talk about a deeper dive into radical candor.
Thanks, Janice. So once you've gotten that basis of psychological safety, you can use radical candor in your coaching relationships. So as you guys remember from the Institute, radical candor is the concept of caring personally and challenging directly. The caring personally comes in with the relationship that you've built, the trust that you've built with that person. That doesn't happen without psychological safety as the basis. And then challenging directly, so being honest and clear and concise in your communication. But in a coaching relationship, you're also going to need 3 other principles, and that is being open, being aware, and being helpful. So, for instance, maybe you've used a common phrase or slang around those in your circle for years, but the current context you're in could have that same phrase, like, be a little offensive. I know that Janice shared a story with us before about a friend who shared a phrase that had some connotations around Jewish people that Janice, because she was friends with the person, didn't find it offensive, but other people who didn't have that relationship might have found that offensive. So being able to be aware of where you are in the relationship that you're in, whether you're with a colleague that you really trust and you can kind of go there critically, or whether you're with someone that you kind of need to be a little more reserved with. And then be helpful. So I know that I've been in place. I don't know if any of you have been in the place before where someone is giving you advice, but you know it's not to be helpful. So it's like kind of passive aggressive or shaming advice, which kind of erodes that psychological safety and that trust in that relationship. So when you go into a coaching situation, you want to make sure that you have the right context for giving feedback and that your goal is to help the other person.
And again, and as we always say, coaching using the strengths, some of the finding ways to celebrate strengths or optimize the strength usage that that you see apparent in whatever situation that's there. So,
Kim Scott, who wrote Just Work, her new book, shared a few tips on how to give feedback in a coaching relationship, especially when there are biases in the workplace, and that includes stating your intention to be helpful. So a quick way to preface it could be, I'm going to tell you something because if I were in your shoes, I'd want to know so I could fix it. There's show, don't tell, which is being specific in both criticism and praise, like Janice said, leaning on the strengths of the person to be like, I know that you were using your strength of in this situation, and that's awesome. But right now we might need the strength of judgment, or we might need the strength of perseverance with the original idea. Finding help is better than offering it yourself. So this is one that I've had to use a lot as a classroom teacher, being able to say, I don't know the answer, but I know someone who does, or I know how to get you the answer. Being able to have that humility and know whether you can actually help this person with something, or whether you actually need to get them another colleague or a coach or a resource you need for that situation. And then feedback as a gift, not a whip or a carrot, just like I was saying with giving feedback only to help. Don't let the fact that you can't offer help make you reluctant to offer feedback. So maybe you're not the person with the skills or the exact tools that they need for that situation, but you can still offer them feedback and say, this is something you can work on, and here are resources you can use. And then sharing the context finally. So this is good for high impact leaders, senior leaders. When you're talking with a person and giving them kind of coaching in a relationship, you want to be able to say, like, what is the impact of their work? Like, why is their work important? So if you're giving feedback on a certain project, being able to say, hey, this project is important to the company because of blank, so that the person knows why you're giving them feedback. Is there anything you guys like to add to that?
well, so Maya, I just wanted to give them a little context of, so Kim Scott is the one who wrote Radical Candor. So that's where she really, did all her foundational work. And in the last couple of years, she really realized that in order to have radical candor, she understood, the concept of psychological safety, but in order to have that, you have to have a just workplace. So she really tied together the idea of being able to give all this feedback, as Maya just laid out, in a way that celebrates everybody, makes everybody feel included and heard. And in the book itself, this is a book worth getting also and reading and understanding, because it's really about developing an equitable and safe and just workplace. So she ties everything back to that, so what we're going to dive in now is going to really explore some of the biases that whatever conversation you come, as a human being with some personal biases, whether they're stereotypes or whether they're just cultural affiliations or just habits that you've always had. And they can impact how you have that conversation in a way that to make it most helpful. So So anyway, Kim Scott really is the expert in giving feedback, and now she's layering on top of it the idea of doing it in a just workplace, which is really a fascinating read. So moving to, I'll let
Our next
Gina.
activity, the fun stuff. So we are going to do an activity around certain statements, 5 statements that you see on the screen. And we're going to get in groups and kind of discuss the bias around in these statements and discuss what we think like the impact of these statements would be in the workplace. And I'm going to separate you guys into breakout rooms and talk about them. The first statement is, I assume someone who is introverted will never be a good leader. It's easier to give feedback to someone who is like me. I judge people by their educational credentials and or the schools they've attended. I sometimes don't give feedback because I'm scared I might appear biased. Or any majority group can create an exclusive culture. So what I want you guys to do is I'm going to send you guys to breakout rooms, but before I do that, I want you guys to look at the numbers and remember the number of your breakout room, because that is the number of the statement you're going to be discussing. So you're going to discuss the bias in the statement, what impact it might have on work outcomes, and how might strengths-based coaching play a role in confronting the bias in that statement.
And I am trying to load into the chat room a file that will show you and Maya, you might have access to this too, so that you have the questions with you when you're in the breakout rooms. So I'm sorry, here they are. So everybody can download that. And that will show you both the questions on how to discuss these, because here's the questions. Discuss the bias in the statement. What impact might it have on your work outcomes? And how might strengths-based coaching play a role in confronting the bias? So you'll see that these are things that, you might not immediately see as biases, but think about it as they may be, and how they might affect how you would have a conversation around improve, getting a better outcome. Does that make sense? Does everybody see? So you're going to be sent into a breakout room. If you're number one, then you're going to focus on the number one. And when you think about it also, I'd like you to think about yourselves as a think tank, a round table that you're working on, figuring out these questions, and that one person will be able to report back out to the group after. So one person should be thinking about being able to share out with everybody after. So as you go through these different, you'll have one statement to focus on.
Welcome back.
And now we'd like one person from each group to share out just what your discussion was about. I'm echoing a little, I think. So who wants to start? What group? Group one. Who from group one wants to share out? Who was in group one? And there may be one group that we didn't get to do. Libby, were you in group one?
Yeah, I was in group one. So discussing the bias, the preference for an extroverted, perhaps personality type in leadership. Did you want me just to look at the very first sentence or go through each of what we talked about?
No. Did you just do question one, or did you do all of them?
Then we looked, we didn't really get to the third one, but the impact it has on the work outcomes, looking at how that can affect performance evaluations and promotions and create more of a perhaps homogeneous culture in top leadership in a workplace culture that would prioritize or value extroverted types.
And how do you think if somebody were introverted in your organization, and you were worried about them possibly not being promoted into a leadership position, how would you coach them, or how might you coach somebody else in your organization? Like what could you do to change that bias that's there, that that exists?
think in a kind of a broad sense, to the strengths, the overall culture of appreciation of strengths, spotting, having that be a consistent part of workplace culture and recognition. So it's not just happening one-on-one, perhaps in reviews, but it's a workplace, again, a norm, a working norm, to have strengths recognized that may have nothing to do with introvert, extrovert. So I think that would be important.
I think it's sometimes a
Yeah.
challenge. Like, do you coach that person to be more extroverted, or do you coach leadership to be more open to realizing that that person has other talents?
Yeah, I can't speak for our group, but I would say the second, absolutely. I think it's a shift in culture and perspective about the bias of extrovert versus introvert.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Has anybody ever seen that show up in their own organizations or experienced it themselves? Kyla, you're shaking your head.
We're really just having a lot of trouble over here with technology. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so I shared, and we had just talked about this at our training, that professionally, I feel I'm an extrovert. A lot of zest. My team definitely lacks in that, but personally, I'm really introverted. So it's this funny blend of really tapping into those strengths that work for me, like here at work, right? But then also in my personal life. And I feel like using all of those together, those introvert extrovert pieces, have helped me become a good leader of a team that is, made up of so many different personalities.
Well, I think that's interesting because according to this, maybe that person in some cultures wouldn't get promoted, but you have a sensitivity to understanding an introvert person, what that situation is for somebody who is introverted, and you might
Right.
be able to, coach them how to be, like you learned how to be an extrovert, and or how to help leadership understand that they have other talents that may not be as obvious.
Yeah.
Number 2, thank you, Kyla, for sharing, and thank you, Libby, for starting that out. And what group? Number 2, group 2. Did somebody focus on feedback? Is it easier to give feedback to someone who is like me? Is that true? What does that mean? Group 2. Adam, were you group 2?
I was not. I was group 4.
Group 4. Anybody group 2? There was one group I know we missed. It might have been group 2, but this is a very common, as we all know, confirmation bias, and it goes into whether it's who we hire, it's how we celebrate people, and it's certainly how we coach. So it's easier to coach somebody. You feel much more comfortable if somebody walks in and you have some kind of identity connection, and it could be anything from gender to racial to even personal, like what frat you belong to, but something that makes you feel like I know that what I say they're going to understand and they're going to hear, and I'm not scared or concerned that it's going to hit a bad note. And so that's something to be aware of. So I know, so has anybody ever had that experience where they've had to coach or been coached by somebody who they didn't really feel comfortable with, and how that impacted some of the communication?
I can speak to that. I am somebody who has a tendency to be, I'm a very direct personality. So if I'm doing something wrong, just tell me what I'm doing wrong. And I had a supervisor who was much more of a kind of dance around the topic before they would get to it. So I found supervision or feedback from them very frustrating because I just kept thinking, get to the point, get to the point, get to the point. And so sometimes when I receive feedback from somebody who's like me, I receive it a lot easier than I do if somebody whose personality doesn't gel with mine. So I think it's always a challenge to give feedback to someone who in a lot of ways is not like you, because you don't know how it's going to be received. And in some ways you don't know how to say it because you start to worry, is what I'm saying going to be misunderstood or misperceived because you know there's not a match in personality.
And I'm so glad you said it's exactly true. And then what you showed is that there's there's limited psychological safety in that experience, because you should feel safe to make it, to hit a wrong note or to make a mistake or to push back on that person. And I've had people push back to me. I used to give feedback that was circular like that, and I would have people who work for me that were really direct, and then I could see it in their eyes. And I'm grateful that they had the nerve, right? They felt safe enough to push back and say, just what are you trying to tell me? Give it to me straight. And sometimes it might be leaning into your strength of humor or your strength of perspective or your strength of social intelligence. How do you find, that way in to be able to soften up the environment enough and say, look, I'm just not hearing what you're saying. So it is pushing back. Again, going back to psychological safety, not saying something to that person, not pushing back, or is worse in the long run than it would be of having had that potential bruise. But again, yes, you have to feel like there's a safe environment where you're not driven by fear of interpersonal retribution in some way. But thank you, Adam, for sharing. I think it can be across all kinds of familiarities. As Adam said, it's just different styles. You're going to hit a different note. Number 3, I judge people by their educational credentials and or the schools they've attended. Does anybody want to group 3? Is that a bias that ever shows up? And how would you confront that bias in terms of coaching? Who would you coach? How would you coach? Who is in group 3? Just anybody?
In group 3. So we talked about how it can be easy to, when you find out someone maybe attended a university or a school that you attended, to put them in that category of someone who is like me automatically, but also keeping in mind to go beyond education credentials and focus on also lived experiences, life experiences, and that just degrees do not always equate knowledge or know-how, especially in specific roles. And so keeping that in mind, both with hiring and coaching.
I think that's great. And what's so interesting is sometimes people who don't have, I often had people who work for me who maybe didn't have a college degree. And so they felt very self-conscious of that. And I found that they wouldn't speak up in meetings at times, or they didn't have the confidence to contribute in the way. And yet I knew they were brilliant. They were street smart. They were just really wise. And so as a coach, it's really important to draw that person out, right? To walk into that coaching situation and know, even if you don't have that bias, they may have a personal bias against themselves, even a feeling of lack of confidence. And so it's important because it really isn't, I think years ago we used that, it's a point of privilege having the education that we have. It has nothing more than to say that you had that opportunity. It really does not necessarily reflect more than that. And in an equitable workplace, you want to be able to compensate for that as a leader and as a coach. So thank you for sharing that. Number 4, I sometimes don't give feedback because I'm scared I might appear biased. Has anybody had that situation?
So I was voluntold that I got to share for our group. We talked about a couple of things. We talked about the fact that sometimes when you are, let's say, in a meeting or in a group of people, you may be looking at the people that are in the meeting and trying to determine what their biases might be or what your perception of them might be, and therefore how is what I'm going to say going to be received by the audience. I'm in some ways maybe making a determination before I speak about how it might be received by the audience based off what my observations are. And then the thing that I personally talked about is I sometimes had the experience where in a meeting, leadership will say something like, what do you all think of that? But before they ask for your opinion, they share theirs first. And then everyone has a tendency to be a little less inclined to disagree because they have a perception that they might be judged because they don't agree with leadership since they spoke first. So you can experience bias in a lot of different ways, and then that can affect your willingness to provide feedback, or you may also just worry about how that feedback is being received by someone.
And again, it goes back to that core psychological safety, which is so interesting. And I wonder, Adam, did you feel in those organizations that you're talking about now? Because did you feel that you would have said, yes, I have psychological safety where I work?
Well, to kind of go back to point one, or whichever one I spoke about first, I'm not somebody that's shy. So what I often find in meetings is that if they give their opinion, I tend to hold back to see if somebody will speak first, and if nobody does, I will sometimes be the disagreeer or the counter opinion. And once someone goes, then other people are more inclined to go because they've now seen, okay, this person shared a counter opinion and they didn't perceive any bias as a result of it. So now they're more willing to be open or talk. So I think sometimes you almost have to test the water. And then once everyone sees, oh, this is safe, they do experience that sense of safety, they're much more likely to talk.
Yeah. So I think that's great. Psychological safety, as I said, it's an easy concept. You think, oh yeah, I get it, and we have it. To prove it and to convince everybody that it's there, it takes somebody bold, a risk taker, to really, make it clear and experiment and showcase and model that behavior for everyone. And it takes a long time to build that trust. So it's not a simple concept. It's really something that is deeply embedded. It has to be deeply embedded in an organization to be most effective, and it has to be across the organization. And you have to create that space by having risk takers lead the way, people who are bold and don't get. Anybody else have any thoughts on that about the idea of being not giving feedback because you're scared you might appear biased?
Anybody else in my group, if I was inarticulate in sharing your thoughts, please speak up.
I'm actually interested in some perspectives as it relates to race and gender in this space specifically. Being an African-American male and leading teams that were not African-American and potentially not even male, there were some thoughts and sometimes where I didn't say things because I didn't want to create an environment where it felt like I was being biased or it didn't come across traditionally as combative or aggressive. Does anybody have any thoughts about that, or even like creating an environment of psychological safety in that sort of environment?
Yeah, I can share. And I think Adam was like, Tara, go ahead and share what you were saying. So that's actually exactly what I talked about. So I looked at it through the lens of a supervisor because I've been a supervisor of several teams in different organizations. And I am always aware of the fact that I'm a Black woman, and I'm starting to show my age now, but I've also looked young for a lot of people. But I think one of the things I've always considered is how is the information that you're receiving being filtered based on your relationship with Black women over your life. So I'm going to communicate information differently to a white man than I would to a Black man or to a Black woman, and also based on age too, because I'm aware that honestly, I've taught too at UC, and I've recognized that in particular, white men don't receive feedback well from Black women because they just don't have a lot of experiences throughout life where they have had to be responsible or receptive to feedback from a Black woman. So it's always a very new, and I think there's a lot of why are you telling, I've always been right, or people have always wanted to hear what I've had to say. So there's always that challenge that I've experienced. So that is exactly what I reflected that on in that situation. So I think it's one of those situations when you fit in a special group, you're always aware of how is this information being received by whatever group of people I'm talking to.
And I apologize for inarticulately summarizing her thoughts on that. We ran out of time in our work group. It was going great.
You don't have to apologize, Adam. I was trying to get through it quickly, but no, I think you are.
That's really interesting. I don't want to take this conversation into a totally off the rails. And I know that we are on a time. I would love to talk about this more. It's super interesting to me.
Well, I think it is. We have a couple minutes, and I think the last one, number 5, might also blend into the same conversation. And I will say that these are all things that came up in the book. So again, I recommend the book. just work, because these are all, she really dives deeper into all of these potential issues or blocks to, good conversation, good communication. But she mentions specifically any majority, she claims, and we can debate this, but any majority group can create an exclusive culture. And in that, then, as if you, so I'm curious, group 5, did you talk about that? And did you find that to be true, or how you would handle that? And if you, if you saw that happening in your organization? So, was there anyone in group 5? Was there a designated speaker? So do people feel that, did people understand what that means? So what she was talking about actually was that it was a women's conference that she referenced, and there was a gentleman who spoke to one of the leaders there, and he went to greet her and he gave her a fist bump. And she said, "Oh, you're the fist bump guy." And he got very offended because he realized everybody was sort of talking about him behind his back, and he was being perceived as that techie fist bump kind of cool dude, right? And he didn't want to, and he felt excluded, and he felt like he wasn't being respected. And so here they are at a women's, organization, women's empowerment meeting, and they realized that they had excluded the guy there, who was really an ally, and they had underestimated him. And they, so in any situation, you can create that exclusivity, that inside joke kind of situation, or insider, dialogue, and how does that feel? And so when you see that in your organization, like, how do you confront it? How do you call it out? How do you coach around it? Is that a peer-to-peer coaching situation where you might say, "Hey guys, this isn't, let's be real here. Like, we are excluding," it could be based on strengths. We've talked about this before. Like, my team is pretty strong on humor, but one or two of us aren't as funny as the others. And it's easy for folks who are very funny to kind of outshine everybody else, and make those folks who aren't naturally, don't have humor as their top strength, feel inadequate. But you can, so how do you coach around that? Do you coach the person, like, try to be more funny and try to fit in? Or do you coach the people, do we have to be more tolerant and understanding, and try not to, set up these barriers or walls or biases?
Yes, I want to say something really quickly about this. First off, you're funny, and you've gotten way funnier hanging out with us for the last 2 years. So don't beat yourself too much.
Yeah.
I think this one's really interesting. The example you shared. I think we have to acknowledge an element of privilege here too, particularly with people who tend to carry a significant amount of that. If we talk about race, for instance, if a white person finds himself in a space where they are one of the only white people, it might feel really like exclusive in some sense. But I think there's a need to have some self-reflection there as well, and recognizing that is an experience that people of color frequently have. And so rather than chalking that up to a group of people being exclusive, maybe reflect on the fact that might be one of the first times when you've been put in a space where you're not surrounded by a bunch of other people who are very much like you. That's not across the board for everyone's experience, but it's something that I've definitely reflected on in my career, and being in spaces for the first time as a young professional where I was one of the only white people in the room, and just kind of processing that and understanding what that means as it relates to privilege. So just want to share that too, as a component of that, as the number 5.
Mm-hmm. So we have, just to give you a sense of coaching conversations before you go in, as Maya talked about, it's really important to understand context. Who are you talking to? What biases do you walk into the room with, the conversation with? What biases might that other person you're coaching even have about themselves or about you? Like, they may have a sense that, you are a white male, 55 years old, so they're going to assume that you're highly traditional and you're not going to understand. And, as a woman, I often walked into those situations and just almost assumed negativity. That negativity bias showed up and created energy in that conversation, and helped that, so I wasn't able to coach up and even express my own vulnerability. If I'm not in a safe environment, I'm not going to say that I feel intimidated by the fact that, and that bias I have about that white male 55-year-old boss might be totally wrong, right? And I walked into the room with that in hand. So in any coaching situation, whether you're coaching up, down, or to the side, understand the bias, the situation, and whether you can model the psychological safety. So what we're going to move now into, so this was just practice for another hypothetical session we're going to explore together. And the way we're going to do this, I'm going to go back a little, is just to remind ourselves of the concept that we call SBI, of how to give radical candor. When you are coaching, it's always important to be as specific and clear as possible. So again, walking into that coaching conversation with in mind, I'm going to talk about the situation at hand, I'm going to name the behavior, and then I'm going to talk about the impact. So we call it SBI. What happened? What is the positive thing that happened? What is the behavior that you want to correct in some way? Name that specific situation. So was it last Monday's meeting? I saw you speak over the other people in the meeting. So that's the last Monday's meeting. The behavior was you were speaking over everybody else in the meeting. And the impact was that a lot of people didn't get to say, express themselves in a creative way. So you really, shut off the creativity in the room. So that's SBI. So that's what you want to keep in mind in addition to all the context and the things we just discussed, because now what we're going to have is I'm going to put into the chat room a document, and this is going to be a shared document. And again, you're going to be in groups of 2 or 3, I think 3 or so. Together, think of yourselves as a think tank. So this is how it will work. The shared document, you'll click on it, you'll open it up. Anybody who writes in it, you can see everybody who's writing. So anybody can write it in it. But you will be assigned one of the scenarios. They're interesting hypothetical scenarios that can happen in any office environment. And then there's some questions associated with that. And after that, we'll get to share out 1 or 2 of these, but you'll also have the deck, because we'd like you to type in as your group answers it, so that everybody will have access to other people's thinking as well. So they're really interesting, they're intriguing, challenging, but very common situations. How would you handle it? How would you coach these folks, especially through the lens of strength? So I'm going to chat it in now.
Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome back, everybody. We were enjoying watching all the notes go into the, to the shared document. I hope it didn't feel creepy to know that we were watching what you're typing, but that's just how technology works these days. It's kind of like a cool perk. It's kind of like when you're in a live session and the facilitators like kind of roam around the room and kind of listen into your conversations. But we have only about 6 minutes left, but we'd love to hear from at least a couple of groups. What are some insights that you pulled out from your hypotheticals? Like, what was that? It was such a short period of time. These hypotheticals have so much context and so many different layers to them. What were you able to pull out and unpack? What insights did you draw out? I'd love to hear from at least 2 or 3 people. I know we've got several folks who needed to jump off, so we're down to our valiant final 8 participants. Can we hear from a couple folks? What did you guys talk about in your conversations?
I'll go. We had the first question, and it was that there's a company of predominantly 40 predominantly white people in the company with 5 people of color. What is the dynamic? There's somebody that's more reserved. How do we coach her? As they noted, like, she had come highly recommended. She's only been at the company 3 months, and they said she was more animated in the interview process. So we discussed, one, prior to coaching, seeing who interviewed her, what made her feel safe.
It's a little hard to hear. Am I the only one having the hearing problem?
No, I am.
I'm not.
It's coming a little bit in and out. It's a little quiet, Taryn. I don't know if you.
Zoom does this to me, so it's me. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's just, we can hear most of what you're saying. It's just a little in and out. So you can
Okay,
keep
I'll try
going.
to talk. I don't know. And then we just said, as a company, have we created an environment that's inclusive and makes people feel welcome? I would say this company has not. And something we talked about was when we bring people into a company that's predominantly white, a lot of times you're just ostracizing whoever's not in the majority, and making them feel like there's an even larger divide and creating an unhealthy environment for them. So understanding that as a company, and then what's our rapport with her to have a conversation to where she feels comfortable expressing how she has been feeling in the company and how comfortable she is being honest with us. So those were some of the challenges that we had kind of talked about.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Taryn. Yeah, that's like I said, there's a lot in all these. It leads to an interesting question about when companies prioritize or organizations prioritize DEI, in what order? There's some interesting insight. If anyone has ever heard of or done any work with Arlene Koss, a fantastic DEI facilitator, she often talks about flipping DEI to really think about it as E first: equity, inclusion, and then diversity, and building a culture that is focused on equity, and then that's inclusive, and then you make it you really focus on the diversity. But if you're focusing on diversity first and you're not really thinking about how to create that inclusive and equitable culture, they can, as you said, Taryn, ostracize those who are coming in, and not create the kind of outcome that I think companies are hopeful for. I wish we had a lot more time with you all to be able to really dive into these hypotheticals, but part of this, we knew we wouldn't be able to go as deep as we could, but this is a tool that you all can use in your own teams to be able to have some of these conversations about coaching. Working through and talking through these hypotheticals is a great exercise as you're thinking about staff professional development, as you're working to build the skills of your managers. This is stuff that we're happy to do, outside of this session with your teams as well, if you're interested. So this is just a little bit of a preview to a tool that we're really excited about. We hope you enjoyed at least an initial engagement with it in these conversations. So I'm going to ask Janice, go ahead and move us along to the next slide so we can start to close out.
Yep.
Appreciate everyone who stuck with us this whole time. So just a few key coaching takeaways. Remember, first off, as Janice shared, or when we shared earlier on in the session, everyone is a coach. There are many different roles that really can be defined as coach. It's not just that traditional top-down kind of model. So everyone can really think about their role in that sense. Psychological safety is foundational when it comes to coaching. It's about taking risk. It's about building that trust. The 3 key tips that we shared there is to really focus on making it a learning culture where folks are continually learning and not focusing on the mistakes, being vulnerable, and modeling curiosity. And then to be an effective coach, you have to manage biases. Remember, we showed the coach framework here that's rooted in radical candor with caring personally and challenging directly, but these other components here of being open, aware, and helpful. So managing those biases is critical. And of course, using strengths to be specific and clear. As always, you have SBI, the situation behavior impact model, to share really clear feedback that removes judgment from the conversation. So just some helpful takeaways there for coaching. And to kind of lastly, we've shared in multiple formats and times our calendar of events for this year. So you can see it right here. We share it every time we send our monthly newsletter for Strong Cincinnati, so you can kind of get a sense of when our events are coming up. Next week, we have a couch conversation where Phil is going to be hosting a discussion with a basketball coach named Coach Fred Batchelor, and Elaine Seuss. Is that the name? That's the name. Yes, who is a leadership coach, and so facilitating some really interesting discussions about coaching insights with them. We hope you can join us for that. It's next Thursday. And then on Tuesday the 25th, we'll have our monthly chat cafe, where it's sort of an open dialogue with any members of the network who want to get together and talk about coaching challenges. So that's what's coming up immediately in the next 2 weeks. Finally, I think you might have already shared this possibly no, you shared the calendar, but we have just a really quick evaluation for today's session. If you could take a moment just to quickly fill that out, let us know what you think, what went well, what was helpful, what we could do better. We always appreciate your feedback. So with that, great to see you all. Thanks for joining us.